All right, we've now got the same sim. So we've got a condensed in position range versus a linear out of position range. We've got a 5-to-1 SPR, same ranges. So as far as what they look like, linear, aces through fours, condensed, queens through sixes. Okay, queens through sixes. And just a little bit deeper now. Okay, so just like every single time, think about what you think the out of position strategy looks like, what has changed, what is the same, how does the overall strategy look, why does it look that way? Pause the video, give it a thought. All right, so just like always, I haven't actually looked at this. So if you haven't paused it, pause it. I'm going to give you my spoiler now. So I have not looked at this one. A few things that are very obvious to me. One, strategy is going to look a little bit chaotic. Your out of position is always going to look a little bit chaotic. There will be blocking and betting 30% and 50% and probably pot. And that's because you've got the symmetric part of the range. And the symmetric part of the range is queens through sixes. Okay, so you can think about it. It can be helpful when you're playing to think about it as almost having two ranges. And you can carve, some of the language I use when I'm coaching people is like, I might call it like a carve out. And so you can carve out, this is why I use this language. You can carve out aces, kings, fours and fives. Okay. And you can call that like your polarized range. Right. And then you can say, I have queens through sixes, which is the other guy's range. Right. So you've got this symmetric range, which is queens through sixes. And then you've got this polarized range. Okay. And that can just be a very helpful way for organizing your thought process, because what's the polarized range want to do? At a 5-to-1 SPR, you should think about it for a second. What's it want to do? It shoves. Some people are gonna be like, oh, it's 5-to-1 SPR. You shouldn't jam for 5x pot. Yes, you should. In this situation, you should. Aces, kings, fives, and fours there's gonna be some shoving from that region. Primarily from like, you could think about it, you could simplify it if you wanted to call it aces, kings, and fours, because you have a 2-to-1 bluff to value. It's not gonna be 2-to-1. Sorry about that, I misspoke. We can figure out the bluff to value ratio here very quickly. So this range will be 55% value bets and 45% bluffs. Damn, that's quite a high bluff to value ratio. And so it's the call, which is 5 divided by the total pot after the call, which is going to be 11. 5 plus 5, which would be the bet and the call, and then 1, which was the money in the middle previously. So 45% bluff to value ratio, 55% value bets there. So you're going to get to bluff with a lot of fours and fives, actually. And yeah, so that's the way that I would think about it. Okay, and again, I haven't seen this, so like I could just look very silly in about 2 seconds. But that's the way that I would think about it. Okay, so I think there's going to be a lot of jamming for 5x pot, and I don't think that there's going to necessarily be as much like 3x pot or 2x pot necessarily. You're going to see some of those answers, but I don't think that they're going to be great. I think you're going to see a lot of density in the 5x pot answer, and then a lot of density in terms of the strategy and frequency, and then a lot of density in the 0 to 1x pot answer, where the symmetric ranges kind of go. Okay, let's see what happens. So we've got 3x pot here. You can see that that's not really chosen. 2x pot's chosen kind of a lot, but here's the 5x pot. Okay, that takes the cake. And if you just look at this, as far as single bet sizes go, it's the most frequently chosen single bet size. Obviously, we are betting smaller more often. There are more hands in those ranges. Aces and kings are betting to 5x pot very frequently. Okay, and that makes lots of sense to me. Fours and fives are similarly betting to 5x pot pretty frequently. Fives is betting to 5x pot 42%. Fives and fours are identical hands in the context of this model. Keep in mind the opponent's range starts at sixes, so there's really no difference between fours or fives, and so they play identical down to the very frequency for every single combo. That makes sense to me. Aces and kings are similarly asymmetric when the opponent's range starts at queens and play identically. Yeah, so I mean, like, there's jamming, lots of it. So that's predictable. Okay, like I think that some people they really struggle with understanding like how a solver is going to behave, and it's really helpful if you just know before you look at it what it's going to do. And then we have like again, there is this 2x pot answer, which queens actually does prefer 2x pot, which I think is kind of cool. Like that, I mean, maybe prefers is the wrong language, but 2x pot's being chosen 53% of the time, so slight preference. I mean, like I've got majority of the 2x pot answer there is queens, offset by fives and fours. Sixes is bluffing on occasion, less checking. Sevens and eights check a lot. Jacks, tens, very close to pure bets. So we're still seeing this like profile of equity which granted there's a sliver of check here, but you're still seeing this profile of equity, which is not the nuts. The nuts is being allocated to check, right? The nuts is mixing and being allocated to check fairly often. But if you look at like jacks and tens specifically, and queens in this particular sim, these hands are not being allocated to check. So these like hands, again, I'll express the same type of properties or attributes. These hands are hands that clearly get a lot of value against the range of queens through sixes. Jacks and tens win a lot. But they don't really want to find themselves check raising, right? Because as the pot gets really big and they play for stacks, like that's terrible. So these are hands that, you'd much rather check raise aces and kings, which is pretty obvious. So jacks and tens in that context are like very close to pure bets. Sevens and eights, hands that, beat the worst bluffs but still rank towards the bottom of the range. And again, don't want to be utilized as bluffs. Those hands pure check. So a lot of this behavior is predictable. And that's really what we're trying to get after. What I'm trying to get after for you guys is the idea that you can build a strategy that reflects the principles that a solver would drive a solver in the same kind of situation without actually ever seeing the solution, right? Because there are simply too many situations. There's too much. The data is too overwhelming. Even if you were to lay it all on a spreadsheet, the spreadsheet would be too big. So even if you had the ability to organize it, you still couldn't organize it well enough. You can try to, you have to do some kind of simplifications. And there are different types of abstractions different people might try to use, but I think toy games, taking it down to its most basic elements, has a lot of power. So with that, we can stop the out of position strategy now and go ahead and take a look at in position. Okay, so now we've got the in position strategy with the out of position player having checked, and we can take a look at what this looks like. So in position here is betting to a pot size. In position is not going nuts. In position does not really want to play a big polarized tree game. One of the ways I like to tell my students to understand and think about this is you want to think about the type of game you actually want to play, right? So the out of position player kind of wants to play a big bet game, right? If the out of position player has those hands, aces and kings, which always win. And so if we're playing for stacks, the out of position player is doing quite well. In position is really not trying to play for stacks because in position lacks aces and kings, right? In position is trying to play against like the weaker and more vulnerable parts of the out of position player's range. So we're constraining the bet sizing choices here to pot, half pot. Once again, we're not seeing, very important, what you do see, what you don't see. We're not seeing any bet sizing to 10 or 30% at any kind of reasonable frequency, which is just very important for playing purposes. I see lots of players who bet way too small in position on the river in inappropriate contexts. And you can see that in all the models we've looked at so far, it's not been appropriate yet. Again, there is a time and a place. Again, if you're trying to get to black belt level for poker, there's a time and a place, but it's rare enough that for the most part, if you just stripped it out, you'd be playing quite well. Yeah, I mean, like, the bet size is limited to half pot and pot, which keeps it pretty simple. We're value betting at the top of the range. We're bluffing at the bottom. We bluff with sixes. We value bet with queens and jacks. Tens is mixing. I think there's more to say about this part of the tree than that. And we can go ahead and take a look at the versus bet strategy now for out of position. All right, so now we've got versus bet strategy for the out of position player when in position bets to a pot size. So when in position bets to a pot size, the out of position player is primarily jamming. And that's because jamming is just making a bet, right? And so there's really no reason. I mean, although it's chosen this like 475 answer at a 25% at a small weight here, I suppose. But there's really no reason to choose a sizing choice other than jam. I mean, we could simplify these are basically the same answer. Okay, I think it's kind of interesting that it's done this as a solver, but like whatever. So I think if I solved it down far enough, it would have stripped this out. It's kind of inelegant. Nonetheless, we can simplify the raising strategy to shoving. And that's it, right? The raising strategy will just be a jam. And that's because aces and kings are the nuts. They always win, and jamming is just betting. So so these combos just behave the exact same way that they would behave in the bet strategy, where they just like to overbet a lot. So if we're going to raise, and we're going to raise with aces and kings, and we're not going to raise with anything else because we don't actually have queens or jacks or anything like that to think about raising with, what sizing choice do we choose? It's pretty obvious. We choose shove. These combos, again, are asymmetric, and that's why. They are not combos that the in-position player is betting. We pair bluffs with those hands. The bluff to value ratio is something to make sure that you keep track of. So the out of position player here is betting 500, and the total pot after the bet will still be 1100. So it should still look like, oh, nope, it's not going to look like that. Sorry. So to estimate the bluff value ratio, we take the 400, which is going to be the villain's call. We're taking the villain's call divided by the total pot after the call, which will then be 1100 because we can't get the pot any bigger than that. And this will be the bluff to value ratio. And this is because this is the equity that the in position player needs to call versus the shove. The in position player will need to call a bet of 400. The total pot after they call will be 1100. Keep in mind, starting stacks for 500, and there's 100 in the middle. So 500 plus 500 is 1000, plus 100 for the starting stack is 1100. So 400 here divided by, so that's the amount that's to call, divided by 1100. This will determine how much equity the bettor needs to call. And the equity that the bettor needs to call is going to come from where? Well, it can't come from aces and kings because aces and kings always win. So where does the equity that the bettor needs to call come from? It comes from the frequency that the raiser bluffs. That's where all of the equity for the bettor is going to come from. It's going to come from the frequency that the raiser bluffs. And so the frequency that the raiser bluffs is going to be 36.36% in order to drive, because this is what maximizes the EV of the raising range. So okay, so we've got that. I think that with that we can, and then I guess we can establish that, sevens, eights, and nines are bluff catching hands. And to a lesser extent, tens, it is here, even though it's not very visible. But sevens, eights, nines, and tens beat bluffs. Sixes doesn't. So sevens, eights, and nines mix. These hands beat bluffs and lose to value. So these are kind of quintessential bluff catchers, and these hands mix. I think tens is probably a hand that maybe your opponent's value betting with sometimes. Yes, to pot, yes. So that because tens is a hand that your opponent's value betting with, you don't really fold it. So you don't really fold hands at the bottom of your opponent's value betting range. So if opponent's value betting tens, we call it tens. So I think that should explain most of the out of position versus bet strategy. And we can now move on to the in position versus bet strategy. All right, and we are now going to take a quick look at the in position versus bet strategy. We'll just simplify and we'll take a quick look at the jam. So before we take a look at the jam, we'll just do some basic math. The bettor is risking 500. Total pot after the bet will be 600. So we're expecting an 83% fold. This is how we estimate fold percentage. So I'm expecting an 83% fold here before we look at the model when we bet 500. Okay, so we bet 500. We got an 83% fold. Perfect. You can see that we've driven the top of the range to indifference. Why have we driven the top of the range to indifference? Think about it for a second. Because some people are like, oh, I'm at the top of my range. I have to pure call. Like that's what they think, right? Why are we not pure calling the top of our range? Pause, think about it, come up with your answer, write it down on a piece of paper. I don't care. Okay, cool. So what's the answer? You still just have a bluff catcher, man. Still just a bluff catcher. So doesn't matter if you're at the top of your range. You have queens. The other guy has aces and kings or a bluff, right? So against aces and kings or a bluff, what's the difference between queens or jacks or tens or not? Like there's no difference, right? Queens is constraining queens. So that's the reason why you would be overweight queens in the defending strategies, because obviously if you started calling with just as much jacks and just as much tens and just as much nines, the other guy might start 5x potting it with queens, for example. So queens has a constraining component to it around the introduction of additional hands to the strategy. But outside of that, which is, aside from that property, there's no difference between queens and jacks, right? They both lose to aces and kings, and they both beat fives or fours, which are where the bluffs are coming from. And in that regard, there's really no difference between queens and nines or queens and eights. Okay. So fold percentage was predictable. This behavior that we're seeing, that we're observing, is also predictable. Yeah, yeah, so with that, I think we can leave it here, and we can hopefully you guys are getting a lot out of this exercise, and we can move on. So thanks, guys.